So, Evian, I have just been so blessed to be to have you in my life. First, as a dear friend, most important to me, but also as my primary mentor in this space. You really taught me what applied integrative neuroscience was all about, and so much of my work is based on the hard work that you've done. So, in your short time on this planet, I think you've accomplished more than anyone I know and all the work that you've done, but yet you're still putting out new stuff. And I know this book is really special to you. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about why you felt like this book was so important in this particular moment in time.
Well, thank you, Heidi. And I will say I've been equally blessed. Your network community and key opinion leaders, but just loyal, massive community that you have has just been wonderful to like the magnanimous way you've shared, especially the insights about stress that you've gleaned from over 50 key opinion leaders around the world. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. I know this is not about a stress podcast and broadcast, but I do want to start with why today. I'm not a birthday person. My life has been a mission on the brain, applied integrative neuroscience. But I did turn 70 today, and it is a bit of a reckoning, and I knew it would be. We all are on a brain journey, whether we like it or not, from birth till death, and to some people believe beyond. But the reality is that for me, I had an enormous privilege, Heidi, of being exposed to some of the world's key opinion leaders and founders of different disciplines in the brain. And I feel like this was always going to be my day to pass forward as best as I could in the most distilled way that I was able to under the ridiculous time constraints that I have with all the big stuff going on at work. I was privileged to be born in Africa, in South Africa. There's a different sun that rises over Africa. For those of you who've ever been to a game reserve, but the woman that changed my life is in the top screen. It's Miss Ples, my PhD supervisor. I was on my journey, my science and medical journey, to become a cardiologist, to do research into serum lipids was my PhD, and my PhD supervisor, Professor Philip Tobias, was also he looked after the fossils in Southern Africa. And this is the fossil, Miss Ples, 5 million years ago that she was running around. It is the missing link. Scientific American have said this is one of the 25 most important discoveries in the history of science. And the reason is it was the first fossil that was found between humans and apes, and there's been a trebling in brain size since that time. And when I held Mrs. Ples in my hands, Ms. Ples, and saw that she was bipedal and that there had been a trebling in brain size from Australopithecus to Homo habilis to Homo erectus to us, and I was living within the abomination of apartheid, it seemed so odd to me that something was really wrong fundamentally with our brains, that the cradle of humankind, which is this wonderful institute that Professor Tobias set up, which is a World Heritage site, to remind us all that we all come from the same place. So how ironic that in South Africa, something like apartheid could exist. And then I started to also see, as I really became so shaken by this, that there were many other examples where there's some disconnection in our brain, this them-us connection, this ability to only see short term and to have these enormous distortions and biases about them and us. And there are three, it's a very short book. It's the essence. Many of you will have heard some of this essence from me in various bits, from our discussions, Heidi, from our course with that we've mentioned at Harvard and EO around the country. But this is very simply about knowing, doing, and integrative wisdom. So the first chapter is just very simply about knowing that until you align your non-conscious emotion, intuition, and conscious rational thinking, you are walking around in the dark. Now, I've deliberately not put it that starkly before because I felt I had to wait to 70 to really tell people what I think. And it's not a nihilistic or pessimistic issue, quite the opposite. That there's so much contextual distortion, reality distortion, polarization of orders of magnitude that were absolutely unimaginable when I was first exploring this option. Next slide, please, Heidi. So that's the takeaway. Of course, safety first is the organizing principle of the brain for both safety and reward. But you and I both know, Heidi, and have had a wonderful series of discussions as we move forward with Dr. Donna Palmer and the international database that I set up to mine the deeper insights of stress that add to this, the stress axis and the relaxation response emotion. This non-conscious, I call it non-conscious because it's not unconscious and it's not subconscious, because that makes it feel like emotion and intuition are somehow, subservient to rational thinking. They are not at all. And so they're all interplay. And so I called it non-conscious deliberately. So this non-conscious hijack that drives all our stress is the same, I believe, non-conscious, or the evidence points to, more importantly than my beliefs, the evidence points to these non-conscious hijacks that drive our stress. And also even our hijacks with dopamine and reward. They come from the same place. That can be part of these 100 biases, over 100 biases that we have, that can also create abominations like them, us, but also challenging other biases, like they're challenging our confirmation bias. So that's the essence, Heidi, of the knowing. And I know that you and I and Donna and others are now moving forward. And thanks also to the American Institute of Stress, which thanks to you, I was introduced to, and I'm a proud fellow there now, and I love their content magazine, which I contribute to regularly. We are now starting to percolate this additional dimension in a more forthright manner than I think has previously been the case. So is that a fair summary, Heidi, of our efforts?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, we've talked about this a lot. And the first thing is just to help people who might not be as familiar with your work. A lot of people confuse emotion and feelings.
Yeah.
So we look at those a little bit differently. So just in kind of a Cliff Notes version, how would you describe the difference between emotion and feelings?
Yeah, and this is the wonderful thing of being driven by the deepest possible science we could. We had these big laboratories that measured non-conscious processing. How do you do that? Well, you can actually present stimuli like face emotions so rapidly that the person can't see them. And then you measure them, and we could then see objectively and publish that fear, for example, is processed at 30 milliseconds faster than any other emotion. But more importantly, all these emotions, these snapshots, these rapid decisions that are the basis of our emotions to tell us, is it threatening? Is it rewarding? Happen in 1/5 of 1 second. 1/5 of 1 second. Our lives are driven in 1/5 of 1 second. And that is a massively challenging disconnection, which started to resolve for me this misplaced conundrum. Then what happens? So that is what happens. It would appear, and you can look at the papers and data and judge for yourself. Then, at about half a second, we start becoming consciously aware of the subjective experience and implications of that decision. If it's fearful, we start to have an increase in heart rate, sweat, breath, and that is feelings. And the way I also see it, Heidi, and discuss it quite deeply in the book, is that the emotions are like primary colors. But the feelings, there are over 4,000 words in the English language for feelings. Most people can identify 500. So it's like all the colors in the rainbow from the primary colors, which, as we all know, the rainbow is simply a composite of primary colors. Orange and yellow is, red and yellow is orange. And so that's it. It's not that complicated. And psychologists, because they initially did not embrace this kind of neuroscience, now they absolutely do on steroids, and in many ways lead the way. They conflated emotion and feeling, and many other groups of people conflated emotions and feelings. They are very different, very complementary, and it is very empowering to deconstruct and really explore ways we can best become more aware of and determine strategies to better self-control and intervene in that mechanism.
And I think that's just so, so important. And I know for me, it's changed my life, not just professionally in what I teach and how I try to coach, but also just how I try to deal with my own anxiety and waves of depression and kind of what sensory cues are going on. So I find it funny that in this moment, I've been living in this new place now for a couple of months. This is the first time I've heard landscapers, and they're literally right out my window. So there's a stimulation for me that's going on, but I can identify where it's coming from. So it's not anxiety over this conversation, which I love, and there's excitement and it can feel similar, but there's also what's going on, in our non-conscious processing. And I think for me, that's been one of the biggest takeaways because so much of our focus when we're trying to change habits, I've found, has been more cognitive behavioral therapy types of things, which I think are wonderful. They're a piece of the puzzle. But it's very hard to change your thought processes when your physical body is being overstimulated.
Yeah. And I think the point I'd like to end on in this, Heidi, is that, basically information and context is power. And yes, we need to do all those training tools that we do and develop, and CBT and mindfulness, of course. But the closer you get to the mechanism, the greater you impact it. It is not complicated. It is basic biology. It is basic everything in science as we know it. And in practice, even if you have a spiritual practice, the fact of the matter is having some sense of the interconnectedness of things. The more real that can be, the more immersively you can go into it. And the more you're aware of this mechanism, the more you can at least begin to not be, fear can be helpful to keep us out of danger, but it can also keep us from discovering our authentic self. And so understanding that fear and befriending that fear. And I know you and Karen and other, Buxman and others, curiosity about fear. All of these things that you teach and have been and propagated, on such a massive scale. These are all things that are aided, I believe, by a deeper understanding of the mechanism. So that's it.